9,200 feet above the Middle East, there is a ruin that should not exist. It is the highest temple ever built anywhere in the ancient world, sitting on the summit of Mount Hermon, roofless, broken, and exposed to wind that never really stops. Long before Rome built there, a banned book claimed something descended on this exact peak. 200 beings, named, counted, bound by an oath. The book was cut from almost every Bible on earth. Fragments of it were buried in a desert cave centuries before Christianity began. Historians call the story a symbol. Then a real inscription was pulled from that summit, carved in the language of an oath. Start with the mountain, not the myth. Mount Hermon is the tallest point in the entire Levant, 2,814 meters. Snow on the upper slopes most of the year, visible from Damascus, from the Sea of Galilee, from villages that have looked up at it for 3,000 years. And at the very top, above the tree line, above where anything should reasonably be built, there is a temple. Qasr Antar. Not a shrine, not a roadside altar. A full temple, cut from stone, dragged and assembled at an altitude where the air itself gets thin. It is, as far as archaeologists can tell, the highest temple structure anywhere in the ancient world. That alone should stop you. Someone hauled cut stone to the top of the highest mountain in the region and built there, not near it, on it. Around its base, spread across the surrounding slopes, sit more than 30 other temples and shrines, an entire ring of sacred architecture. And a striking number of them appear oriented toward that one summit. Scholars who have studied the site have openly admitted they don't have a full explanation for the pattern. Not because the ruins are new, because nobody has finished the work of explaining why they all seem to be looking at the same point. That's the strange part before we even open the text. Now let us open the text. The name itself is the first problem. Hermon is not a neutral geographic label. It comes from the Hebrew root herem, a word that means ban, curse, a thing set apart and bound by oath. That's not a guess. That's the accepted linguistic root of the mountain's own name. And an excluded ancient book, the Book of Enoch, makes a claim you don't expect a moral fable to make. It doesn't just describe a spiritual fall happening somewhere vague, somewhere symbolic, somewhere in heaven. It says a group of 200 descended onto the summit of this exact mountain, and that they named it Hermon because of what they swore there.
Read that again. The text isn't using the mountain as scenery. The text is claiming the mountain's name as evidence of the event. That's not how metaphor usually behaves. A parable doesn't normally reach out and rename a real geographic feature that still appears on modern maps and still carries that name today. And this book, the one making that claim, was erased. Not lost, erased. It never made it into the Jewish canon, never made it into the Catholic canon, never made it into the Protestant canon. For most of church history, in most parts of the world, this text simply did not exist to ordinary readers. It survived in exactly one place, Ethiopia, inside the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, preserved in the ancient liturgical language Ge'ez, treated there, and only there, as scripture. It sat outside the reach of the rest of Christendom for centuries before Western scholars finally brought translated copies back in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Ask yourself why a text this specific, this strange, this uncomfortable, is the one that survived only in isolation. Now look at how it actually reads, because this is where it stops sounding like theology and starts sounding like testimony. The passage doesn't open with abstract judgment. It opens with a decision, spoken in the first person by a named leader, Semjaza, who tells the others he's afraid he'll bear the blame alone if this goes wrong. Then they vote. They swear a mutual oath, binding themselves to each other by imprecation, meaning they cursed themselves if they broke it. Then, and only then, 200 of them descend onto one named summit. That is not the language of a symbol. That's the structure of a legal act. A leader states the risk, the group votes. They bind themselves with a formal, mutual curse. And the text gives you a head count, 200 precisely. Then it goes further than any parable needs to go. It organizes them. It lists chiefs of tens, roughly 19 or 20 named leaders, each one responsible for a portion of the 200. That's a chain of command. That's an org chart carved into scripture that was supposedly written to make a moral point about human sin. Field notes have organizational structure. Warnings have organizational structure. Symbols usually don't. And it keeps going. Each named leader in that list isn't just a name. He's assigned a specific human-facing task. One is tied to teaching weapons, one to cosmetics, one to root cutting and plant lore, one to enchantments, one to reading the stars. This isn't a single warning about temptation. It's a distributed list of specific corruptions, each one handed to a specific named figure, like a division of responsibilities. Read it side by side with the rest of ancient religious literature, and it looks less like poetry and more like an inspection record. Someone cataloging exactly what went wrong and who was responsible for which piece of it. Here's where the mountain comes back in, and it comes back harder. Because this isn't a late invention. This isn't something added centuries after the fact by someone trying to spice up a folktale. In the 20th century, fragments of this exact text were pulled out of a cave at Qumran, the same desert region that gave the world the Dead Sea Scrolls. Two of those fragments, cataloged as 4Q201 and 4Q202, are written in Aramaic and have been dated to the late 3rd century BCE. That places this Watcher narrative more than 100 years before the birth of Christ. It is, according to the manuscript evidence, one of the oldest surviving witnesses to the entire idea later echoed in Genesis chapter 6, the sons of God who took human wives. This tradition is older than the objection to it. Whatever this story is, it isn't a medieval embellishment. It was already circulating, already being copied by hand onto leather in a cave, while the rest of the biblical canon was still being finalized. So here comes the official answer. And it deserves to be heard because it's not stupid. Mainstream established interpretation, going back to rabbinic commentary and repeated for centuries by serious scholars, reads sons of God not as literal celestial beings, but as corrupt human nobility, powerful men, judges and rulers who abuse their status, described in exaggerated mythic language because that's how ancient Near Eastern literature often talked about the powerful abusing the powerless. Under that reading, the descent is political corruption. The giants are simply the excesses of tyrant bloodlines. It's a clean explanation, respectable, comfortable. It's also incomplete, because that reading has to quietly step around the one detail it can't fully absorb: the mountain's name. Corrupt human judges don't rename a 2,800-meter peak and have that name survive into the present day on every modern map of the region. One detail like that you could dismiss. But the text doesn't stop at one detail, because there's a second witness. And this is where the story stops being containable to a single manuscript tradition. Separate from the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, there is another text, 2 Enoch, sometimes called the Slavonic Enoch, preserved in an entirely different language, an entirely different manuscript family, centuries and cultures apart from the Ge'ez tradition. And in chapter 18, verse 4, it makes its own reference to the oath being broken, and it locates the event on, in its own words, the shoulder of Mount Hermon. Not heaven in general, not a symbolic elsewhere. The shoulder, a real topographic term, of the same named mountain. 2 manuscript traditions, 2 languages, 2 alphabets, 1 coordinate. Borrowed legends usually blur under translation. Names shift, places get generalized, specifics get sanded down over centuries of copying. This detail didn't blur. It stayed sharp across 2 completely separate transmission histories. Now, the part that turns this from a text problem into a physical one. In 1869, an explorer named Charles Warren climbed to that same summit and recovered a stone stele from the ruins of Qasr-Antar. It's real. It exists today in the British Museum, and it carries a Greek inscription. One respected scholar, George Nicholsburg, translated that inscription as referring to those who take an oath and proceed from here. He connected it, directly in print, to this exact passage, this exact mountain, This exact oath tradition in Enoch chapter 6. Sit with that for a second. A text names a mountain as an oath site. Centuries later, a stone is physically pulled from the summit of that exact mountain, carrying oath language. That is not proof the descent happened. It doesn't need to be. What it proves is that the coincidence is no longer easy to file away. But here's the twist, and it's the kind that should make you distrust anyone who tells you this case is closed either way. The Greek inscription on that stele is disputed. Some readings include a small negating particle, the word ou, meaning not. Restore that particle, and the inscription doesn't celebrate those who swear an oath here. It warns that those who have not sworn may not proceed. Same 6 words, carved in the same stone, and depending on one missing or present letter, the entire meaning inverts. Some careful scholars, working from that alternate reading, reject the Enoch connection outright and call it unfounded. The text didn't move. The stone didn't move. Only the reading did. And notice what even the skeptics can't fully explain away. Why oath language, in either direction, is carved into a temple on this specific summit at all. Whether it says swear here or you may not enter unless you've sworn, it's still the language of a binding vow, cut into stone, on the one mountain an excluded ancient book already claimed as an oath site. Now, this is not a claim that a doorway to anything is sitting under that ruin. It doesn't need to be that literal to be unsettling. What it means is that the physical record on that summit lines up with the vocabulary of the text far more precisely than a coincidence should. And the mountain itself hasn't gotten easier to reach. Hermon has functioned as a literal boundary for as long as it's had a name. In fact, it's had several. The Bible itself records it under at least 2 other titles, Sirion and Senir, used by different ancient peoples for the same peak, according to Deuteronomy chapter 3. A mountain with 3 names in antiquity was a mountain that mattered as a border marker to more than one civilization at once. That hasn't changed. Today, the true summit sits inside a restricted, heavily controlled zone at the meeting point of several modern borders, one of the least freely walkable high points in the entire region. None of that proves an ancient claim. It simply means the mountain the old text called a curse site is right now still functioning as a line nobody crosses casually. Coincidence or not, it keeps the place unresolved. Physically, not just textually. And the temples around it, the 30-plus structures ringing the slopes, remain, by the admission of scholars who've studied them, under-examined. Researchers have gone on record saying there hasn't been a full study explaining why so many of these sites appear oriented toward that one summit ruin. The text is complete. The names are all there. The oath is recorded in full. It's the physical site's meaning that stays open. So here's where the file sits. The ancient text says 200 beings, named, organized, bound by a sworn oath, descended onto the summit of a mountain, and that the mountain's name is the direct result of that oath. The mountain's own etymology matches that claim. Manuscript fragments prove the tradition existed before Christianity, dug out of the same desert that gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls. A second, entirely independent manuscript tradition places the same event on the same mountain, using the same topographic language. And a real stone, pulled from that real summit in 1869, carries oath language that one major scholar linked directly to this text, even as others dispute exactly what the stone says. The official answer still calls all of it symbolic. Corrupt nobility, mythic exaggeration, a moral lesson dressed in dramatic language. Maybe. That answer is still allowed to be true. But it has to now explain a mountain that renamed itself according to the text, a stone inscription that speaks the same oath language the text describes, 2 separate ancient manuscripts that agree on the same coordinate, and a summit that, to this day, sits inside one of the most restricted zones on the map. The wind is still moving across that ruin right now. The stele is still behind glass in London, and scholars are still arguing over one missing letter. The names in that list, Semjaza and the rest, haven't changed in 2,000 years, and neither has the mountain's name. Somebody called it Hermon because of an oath. That part was never metaphor. That part is still standing at 2,814 meters, waiting for someone to finish explaining it.